The courtroom was packed with people eager to witness what everyone believed would be a simple trial. Lady Margaret, a wealthy widow, sat in the front row with her expensive jewelry glinting under the afternoon sunlight streaming through tall windows. She had accused young Emma, a servant girl barely 16 years old, of stealing her precious diamond necklace worth more than most people earned in 10 years. Emma stood trembling in the defendant's box, her small hands shaking as she gripped the wooden rail. Her plain brown dress was clean but patched in several places, showing her humble background. Dark circles under her eyes revealed sleepless nights spent worrying about her fate. The girl had worked faithfully in Lady Margaret's grand mansion for 3 years, never causing trouble or giving anyone reason to doubt her honesty. Judge Harrison, known throughout the kingdom for his harsh sentences and cold heart, sat high behind his bench looking down at Emma with obvious disgust. His reputation preceded him wherever he went. People whispered that he enjoyed sending poor people to prison, especially when wealthy nobles brought complaints against them. The judge's black robe seemed to make him appear even more intimidating as he shuffled through papers with deliberate slowness. Captain William stood at attention near the courtroom entrance, his Royal Guard uniform pressed perfectly and his sword hanging proudly at his side. He was young for his position, having earned his rank through bravery in recent battles defending the kingdom. His sharp blue eyes constantly scanned the room, watching for any signs of trouble or disruption during the proceedings. Lady Margaret rose gracefully from her seat when called to give testimony. Her voice was smooth and confident as she pointed an accusing finger at Emma. She claimed the necklace had disappeared from her bedroom the morning after Emma had cleaned the room. The lady painted herself as a victim, dabbing her eyes with a silk handkerchief as she described discovering her precious family heirloom was missing. The prosecutor, eager to please the wealthy lady and gain favor with Judge Harrison, presented what seemed like convincing evidence. He spoke of Emma's access to the bedroom, her knowledge of where valuable items were kept, and her desperate need for money to support her sick mother. The man's words painted Emma as a desperate thief who had betrayed her employer's trust for personal gain. Emma's court-appointed defender seemed nervous and unprepared. He stuttered through his questions and failed to challenge the prosecution's claims effectively. The young lawyer was clearly intimidated by the prestigious courtroom and the powerful people arrayed against his client. His weak defense only made Emma appear more guilty in the eyes of the watching crowd. As testimony continued, Emma caught sight of Captain William near the door. Something in his expression made her heart skip. Unlike everyone else in the room, he wasn't looking at her with judgment or disgust. Instead, his eyes held a mixture of concern and something else she couldn't quite identify. Their eyes met for just a moment before she quickly looked away, afraid to appear too bold. The evidence against Emma seemed overwhelming to most observers. Witnesses testified about her financial struggles and her mother's expensive medical treatments. The prosecution argued that desperation had driven the honest girl to commit this terrible crime. Judge Harrison nodded approvingly at each piece of damaging testimony, already seeming to have made up his mind about the verdict. But Captain William noticed something others missed. His trained eye caught subtle details that suggested something wasn't right about this case. Lady Margaret's testimony seemed too rehearsed, too perfect. Her tears appeared forced and her gestures seemed calculated for maximum dramatic effect. The captain's experience in reading people during dangerous situations had taught him to spot deception. Emma's mother sat in the back of the courtroom, coughing weakly into a worn handkerchief. The woman's obvious illness and frailty made it clear why Emma worked so hard to earn money for medicine. The sight of the suffering woman made Captain William's jaw tighten with anger, at the injustice he sensed was unfolding before his eyes. As the first day of testimony concluded, Judge Harrison announced that sentencing would take place the following morning. His tone suggested he had already decided Emma's fate and it wouldn't be merciful. The crowd began to disperse, many already convinced of the girl's guilt based on the presentations they had witnessed. Emma was led back to her cell in shackles, her head hanging low with despair. She had hoped someone would believe in her innocence, but the evidence seemed to point clearly in one direction. The girl spent the night praying for a miracle, knowing that tomorrow would likely bring a harsh sentence that would destroy her young life forever. The second day of trial began with an air of finality hanging over the courtroom. Emma was brought in wearing the same simple dress, but now her face showed the exhaustion of a sleepless night spent in a cold, damp cell. Her hands trembled as she took her place in the defendant's box, knowing that today would likely seal her fate. Captain William arrived early and positioned himself where he could observe everyone in the courtroom clearly. Something about this case continued to bother him deeply. During his years of service, he had developed strong instincts about people and situations. Every fiber of his being told him that Emma was innocent, despite the evidence presented against her. Judge Harrison entered with his usual pompous ceremony, his black robes flowing dramatically behind him. He took his elevated seat and looked down at Emma with obvious contempt already etched on his features. The man had built his reputation on swift, harsh justice that pleased wealthy citizens while crushing the hopes of common people who dared to cross their betters. Lady Margaret made another appearance, this time wearing even more expensive jewelry as if to emphasize what had allegedly been stolen from her. She sat in the front row surrounded by her wealthy friends, all of whom nodded sympathetically whenever she sighed or dabbed her eyes with her silk handkerchief. The prosecution called several servants from Lady Margaret's household to testify. One by one, they painted Emma as someone who had been acting strangely in the days before the necklace disappeared. They spoke of seeing her near Lady Margaret's bedroom at odd hours and claimed she'd been asking unusual questions about the family's valuable possessions. Captain William listened carefully to each testimony, his trained mind picking up inconsistencies that others missed. The servants' stories sounded rehearsed as if they had been coached on exactly what to say. Their body language suggested they were uncomfortable lying, but fear of losing their jobs clearly outweighed their conscience. Emma's defender made a feeble attempt to cross-examine the witnesses, but his questions were weak and failed to expose the contradictions in their statements. The young lawyer seemed overwhelmed by the pressure of the courtroom and the powerful forces aligned against his client. His ineffective defense only made Emma's situation appear more hopeless. During a brief recess, Captain William noticed something significant. He saw Lady Margaret speaking quietly but intensely with her head servant, Mrs. Blackwood, near the courthouse steps. The woman's expression was stern and threatening as she pointed toward the courthouse. The captain couldn't hear their words, but their body language suggested Mrs. Blackwood was being given final instructions about something important. When court resumed, Mrs. Blackwood took the witness stand as the prosecution's star witness. She testified that she had personally seen Emma hiding something small and glittering in her apron pocket the morning after the necklace disappeared. Her testimony was delivered with confidence and seemed to provide the final nail in Emma's coffin. The courtroom buzzed with excitement at this damning testimony. Judge Harrison smiled coldly, clearly pleased with how the case was proceeding. He made notes on his papers while nodding approvingly at the prosecution's presentation of evidence against the young servant girl, but Captain Williams' sharp eyes caught something others missed during Mrs. Blackwood's testimony. When she gestured to show how Emma had supposedly hidden the necklace, her sleeve pulled back slightly, revealing an expensive gold bracelet that seemed far too costly for a servant's salary. The piece of jewelry glinted briefly in the sunlight before she quickly pulled her sleeve back down. Emma's eyes filled with tears as she listened to the false testimony being given against her. She looked around the courtroom desperately, searching for even one friendly face among the sea of people who seemed convinced of her guilt. Her gaze briefly met Captain Williams again, and she saw something in his expression that gave her a tiny spark of hope. The prosecution concluded their case with a dramatic speech about the importance of protecting property, rights, and maintaining order in society. The prosecutor argued that Emma represented a dangerous example of servants who might be tempted to steal from their employers. He demanded the harshest possible sentence to send a clear message to other potential criminals. Emma's defender stood to present his closing arguments, but his words were half-hearted and unconvincing. He mumbled something about reasonable doubt and the possibility of mistaken identity, but even he seemed to believe his client was guilty. The lawyer's weak defense left Emma feeling more alone and hopeless than ever. Judge Harrison called for a brief recess before delivering his verdict. The courtroom emptied except for a few people, including Captain William, who remained at his post. During this quiet moment, he made a decision that would change everything. The captain knew he had seen enough evidence of corruption and lies to convince him that justice was not being served. As people began returning to the courtroom for the final phase of the trial, Captain William positioned himself strategically where he could act if necessary. His hand rested casually on his sword hilt, ready for whatever might unfold in the coming minutes. The trained soldier prepared himself for what he suspected would be a moment requiring both courage and quick thinking. The courtroom fell silent as Judge Harrison prepared to deliver his verdict. Emma stood with her legs barely able to support her weight, knowing that the next few minutes would determine whether she spent years in prison or faced an even worse fate. Her mother watched from the back row, tears streaming down her pale, sickly face. Captain William had spent the recess thinking carefully about what he had observed during the trial. His military training had taught him to analyze situations quickly and act decisively when innocent lives were at stake. The evidence of corruption and false testimony was clear to his experienced eye, even if others couldn't see it. Judge Harrison rose slowly from his seat, savoring the dramatic moment. His reputation for harsh sentences was well known throughout the kingdom, and he clearly enjoyed the power he held over people's lives. The man's cold eyes surveyed the packed courtroom before focusing on Emma with obvious satisfaction. Lady Margaret sat in the front row with a barely concealed smile playing at the corners of her mouth. She adjusted her expensive jewelry and whispered something to her friend beside her. The woman seemed confident that justice, as she defined it, was about to be served against the servant who had dared to challenge her authority. Mrs. Blackwood, the head servant who had given the most damaging testimony against Emma, kept her eyes downcast and fidgeted nervously with her sleeves. Captain William continued to watch her carefully, noting how she seemed uncomfortable despite being on the winning side of the case. The judge cleared his throat and began to speak in his most official tone. He reviewed the evidence that had been presented, emphasizing the testimony about Emma's suspicious behavior and the damning claim that she had been seen with something glittering in her pocket. His words painted her as a dangerous criminal who had betrayed the trust of her generous employer. Emma's knees buckled slightly as she listened to the judge's harsh words. Her court-appointed defender looked defeated, knowing he had failed to save his young client from what appeared to be inevitable conviction and punishment. The man shuffled his papers nervously, avoiding eye contact with Emma. Captain William noticed something crucial during the judge's speech. While emphasizing the importance of protecting wealthy citizens from theft, Judge Harrison glanced meaningfully at Lady Margaret several times. The exchange of looks suggested a level of coordination that went beyond normal courtroom proceedings. As the judge moved toward announcing the actual verdict, Emma felt desperation overwhelming her. She knew that within moments, her life would be effectively over. The girl had heard stories of what happened to servants convicted of stealing from nobles, and none of those stories ended well for the accused. In that moment of complete despair, Emma remembered something her grandmother had told her years earlier. The old woman had worked in the royal palace and knew about secret signals that could be used to communicate with guards in times of great danger. The knowledge had seemed like old folklore then, but now it might be her only hope. Emma looked directly at Captain William and made a subtle gesture with her right hand, touching her heart twice and then pointing toward the ceiling. It was an ancient signal used by palace servants to indicate that they possessed important information about threats to the kingdom or corruption in the courts. Captain William's eyes widened slightly as he recognized the old royal signal. Few people outside the palace knew such communications existed, and even fewer understood their meaning. The fact that Emma knew this particular gesture suggested she had connections to the royal household or had been taught by someone who did. The judge was now reaching the climax of his verdict speech, preparing to announce Emma's punishment for the crime of theft. His voice grew louder and more dramatic as he spoke about the need to maintain order and protect the property of noble citizens from criminal servants. But Captain William was no longer listening to the judge's words. His attention was completely focused on Emma and the significance of the signal she had given him. The gesture indicated that she possessed crucial information about corruption or danger to the kingdom, information that needed to be heard by royal authorities. Emma maintained eye contact with the captain while the judge continued his speech. She could see that he had understood her signal and was taking it seriously. For the first time since her arrest, she felt a glimmer of hope that someone in authority might actually listen to what she had to say. Lady Margaret noticed the exchange of looks between Emma and Captain William. Her expression changed from satisfaction to concern as she realized something unexpected was happening. The woman leaned forward in her seat, trying to understand what was causing this sudden shift in the courtroom's atmosphere. Judge Harrison finally reached the moment everyone had been waiting for. He raised his voice to announce Emma's sentence, confident that he was about to deliver the harsh justice that would please the wealthy nobles who supported his career. The packed courtroom held its breath, waiting for the words that would seal a young girl's fate. Captain William's hand moved to rest on his sword hilt as he prepared to act. The ancient royal signal had changed everything, creating a duty that superseded normal courtroom protocol. He knew that what happened in the next few moments would either save an innocent girl or cost him his position in the royal guard. Judge Harrison's voice boomed through the courtroom as he prepared to deliver what everyone expected would be a harsh sentence. Emma closed her eyes, bracing herself for the words that would destroy her future. The silence in the room was so complete that people could hear their own heartbeats echoing in their ears. Captain William stood perfectly still, his military training keeping him calm despite the tension building inside him. He knew that royal protocol required him to act when someone gave the ancient distress signal, but intervening in a court proceeding would be unprecedented and dangerous to his career. "Emma Hartwell," Judge Harrison announced in his most severe tone, "you have been found guilty of theft from your employer, Lady Margaret Ashworth. This crime represents a betrayal of trust that strikes at the very foundation of our ordered society." The judge paused dramatically, enjoying the power he held over the young girl's fate. Lady Margaret smiled coldly from her front row seat, anticipating the moment when her servant would be properly punished for daring to challenge her authority. Emma opened her eyes and looked once more at Captain William, silently pleading with him to remember the signal she had given. The captain's jaw tightened as he wrestled with the decision that could change everything for both of them. "Therefore," Judge Harrison continued, "I sentence you to 15 years of hard labor in the kingdom's prison, followed by permanent banishment from this region. You will never again be permitted to work in any noble household." Gasps echoed through the courtroom at the severity of the sentence. Emma's mother cried out in anguish from the back row, knowing that 15 years of hard labor would likely kill her young daughter. Even some of the spectators who had believed in Emma's guilt seemed shocked by the harshness of the punishment. But Captain William had heard enough. The combination of the ancient royal signal, the obvious corruption he had witnessed, and the cruel injustice being served compelled him to act. The oath he had taken as a royal guard required him to protect innocent citizens from corruption, even when that corruption came from the courts themselves. The captain stepped forward from his position near the wall, his boots clicking loudly on the stone floor. Every eye in the courtroom turned toward him as he walked with military precision toward the judge's bench. His hand remained ready near his sword, though he had no intention of drawing it unless absolutely necessary. "Your Honor," Captain William called out in a clear, strong voice that commanded attention, "I invoke the ancient right of royal intervention under the Crown's protection of innocent subjects." Judge Harrison's face turned red with fury at this unprecedented interruption. No one had ever dared to challenge his authority in his own courtroom, especially not a mere guard. "How dare you interrupt these proceedings? Return to your position immediately or face charges of contempt." But Captain William continued walking forward, his eyes never leaving the judge's face. "I have witnessed evidence of corruption and false testimony in this trial. As a sworn officer of the Crown, I am bound by oath to prevent the conviction of innocent citizens through fraudulent means." The courtroom erupted in shocked whispers and exclamations. Lady Margaret rose from her seat, her face pale with sudden fear. Mrs. Blackwood looked as if she might faint, her hands trembling as she gripped her chair for support. Emma watched in amazement as the brave captain risked his career and possibly his life to defend her. She had hoped her signal would be recognized, but she had never imagined anyone would actually have the courage to act on it in such a dramatic fashion. Judge Harrison pounded his gavel repeatedly, trying to restore order to his courtroom. "I will not tolerate this insubordination. Guards, arrest this man for contempt of court and disruption of legal proceedings." But the other guards in the courtroom hesitated. They knew Captain William's reputation for honesty and bravery, and his invocation of ancient royal protocols carried weight that even judges had to respect. The men looked uncertainly between their superior officer and the furious judge. Captain William reached the area directly in front of the judge's bench and stood at attention. His voice remained calm but carried the authority of someone accustomed to command in dangerous situations. Your Honor, I formally request that this trial be suspended pending investigation by royal authorities into allegations of corruption and witness tampering. The judge's face grew even redder as he realized his authority was being directly challenged. You have no standing to make such requests in my courtroom. Your oath as a guard does not supersede the authority of this court. But Captain William had studied royal law during his training, and he knew the ancient protocols that still govern situations involving potential corruption. The Crown's protection extends to all subjects regardless of social class. When credible evidence suggests that justice has been perverted through fraud or intimidation, royal guards have both the right and the duty to intervene. Emma felt her heart pounding with a mixture of hope and terror. She could see that Captain William was putting everything on the line for her, but she also knew that powerful people like Judge Harrison and Lady Margaret would not surrender easily. Lady Margaret finally found her voice and stood to address the court. This is outrageous. I demand that this guard be removed immediately. He is clearly attempting to disrupt justice to protect a criminal he has some personal connection to. The accusation hung in the air like a poisonous cloud, threatening to undermine everything Captain William was trying to accomplish. The suggestion that he had improper motives for defending Emma could destroy his credibility and end his career, even if his legal arguments were sound. Captain William turned to face Lady Margaret with steely determination in his eyes. Her accusation of personal involvement was exactly the kind of attack he had expected from someone desperate to hide the truth. His years of military service had taught him how to remain calm under pressure and respond to accusations with facts rather than emotion. My lady, he said with formal courtesy, I have never spoken to the defendant before today, nor do I have any personal connection to her or her family. My intervention is based solely on evidence of corruption that I have observed during these proceedings. Judge Harrison saw an opportunity to regain control of his courtroom. What evidence could you possibly have observed? You are not a lawyer or legal expert. Your opinion about court proceedings carries no weight in these matters. But Captain William had prepared for this challenge. I observed Mrs. Blackwood wearing expensive jewelry that seems far beyond her means as a household servant. I witnessed coordinated testimony from multiple witnesses that appeared rehearsed. Most importantly, I saw Lady Margaret giving what appeared to be threatening instructions to witnesses during recess. The courtroom buzzed with renewed interest as people began to consider these observations. Mrs. Blackwood instinctively pulled her sleeves down to cover her wrists, but several spectators had already noticed the expensive bracelet that Captain William mentioned. Emma watched in amazement as the captain methodically presented his case. She had hoped for help, but she had never imagined someone would be so thorough in defending her innocence. The girl felt a surge of gratitude toward this brave man who barely knew her but was willing to risk everything for justice. Lady Margaret's face flushed with anger and fear as she realized her carefully constructed plan was falling apart. These are wild accusations from a man who clearly has some hidden agenda. I demand that he be removed from this courtroom immediately. But Judge Harrison was beginning to feel uncertain about his position. While he had been paid well to ensure Emma's conviction, he was also aware that challenging a royal guard's invocation of ancient protocols could bring unwanted attention from higher authorities. The man's political survival instincts began to conflict with his corrupt intentions. Captain William pressed his advantage, knowing that hesitation could be fatal to Emma's cause. I formally request that Mrs. Blackwood be asked to explain how she acquired the expensive jewelry she is wearing, and that all household servants be questioned separately about any pressure they may have received to provide specific testimony. Mrs. Blackwood looked terrified as attention focused on her. The woman had been promised a substantial payment for her false testimony, but she had never expected to face direct questioning about her sudden wealth. Her nervous fidgeting made her appear even more guilty to the watching crowd. Emma's court-appointed defender suddenly found his voice, inspired by Captain William's courage. Your Honor, I request that these new allegations be fully investigated before any sentence is carried out. If there is even a possibility of corruption, justice demands that we examine it thoroughly. The young lawyer's sudden change from defeated acceptance to active advocacy surprised everyone in the courtroom. Even Emma looked at him with new respect as he finally began to act like a real defender rather than just going through the motions. Judge Harrison found himself trapped between competing pressures. On one hand, Lady Margaret and her wealthy supporters expected him to proceed with Emma's conviction. On the other hand, the formal challenge from a royal guard created legal complications that could threaten his position if handled improperly. The crowd in the courtroom was now clearly divided. Some wealthy spectators supported Lady Margaret and demanded that the proceedings continue as planned. But many common people were beginning to see Emma as a victim of corruption rather than a criminal, and they called for the investigation that Captain William had requested. Lady Margaret realized that her position was becoming increasingly precarious. The woman had expected a simple trial that would end with her servant's conviction and imprisonment. Instead, she now faced the possibility that her own conduct would be scrutinized by authorities who might discover the truth about the missing necklace. In desperation, Lady Margaret decided to make one final attempt to destroy Captain William's credibility. She stood and pointed dramatically at the guard. This man has clearly been bribed or corrupted somehow. No honest guard would interfere with justice unless he had been paid to do so. The accusation was so serious that it could result in Captain William facing court-martial and imprisonment if it were believed. The captain's jaw tightened with anger, but he maintained his professional composure as he prepared to respond to this attack on his honor and integrity. Emma could see that the situation was reaching a critical point. The brave captain who had risked everything to help her was now facing serious accusations that could destroy his life and career. She knew that she had to find some way to support his efforts, even though she was still technically a convicted criminal awaiting sentence. The tension in the courtroom was so thick that people could almost feel it pressing down on them. Everyone present realized they were witnessing something unprecedented, a direct confrontation between corrupt authority and honest courage that would determine not just Emma's fate, but the very meaning of justice in their society. Captain William's eyes blazed with righteous anger at Lady Margaret's desperate accusation of bribery. The suggestion that he, a decorated royal guard who had risked his life defending the kingdom, would accept payment to corrupt justice was the worst insult imaginable to a man who had built his entire life on honor and duty. The captain's voice carried throughout the silent courtroom as he responded to the accusation. Lady Margaret, your desperation to silence me only proves that you have something to hide. I have served this kingdom faithfully for 8 years, and my record of service speaks for itself. Emma watched the confrontation with her heart pounding. She could see that Captain William's intervention had created an opportunity for truth to emerge. But she also realized that powerful people like Lady Margaret and Judge Harrison would fight viciously to protect themselves from exposure. Judge Harrison saw that the situation was spinning, completely out of his control. The trial that was supposed to be a simple conviction of a servant girl had become a public challenge to the integrity of his court. He needed to find a way to end the confrontation quickly before higher authorities became involved. Enough, the judge shouted, pounding his gavel repeatedly. I will not allow my courtroom to become a circus of wild accusations and disruptions. Captain William, you will face charges for contempt of court and interference with legal proceedings. But Captain William had reached the point where retreat was impossible. He had committed himself to defending Emma's innocence, and he would not back down regardless of the personal consequences. The captain took another step closer to the judge's bench, his presence commanding attention from everyone in the room. Your Honor, he said in a voice that carried absolute conviction, I have sworn an oath to protect innocent citizens from corruption and injustice. I will not stand by and watch while a young girl is sent to prison based on false testimony and fraudulent evidence. Mrs. Blackwood could no longer bear the pressure of being the center of attention. The woman began crying and wringing her hands, clearly struggling with guilt over her false testimony. Several people in the courtroom noticed her obvious distress and began to whisper among themselves about what it might mean. Lady Margaret realized that her head servant was on the verge of breaking down and revealing everything. In panic, she tried to create a distraction that would allow her to regain control of the situation. The woman stood and pointed accusingly at Emma. This girl has somehow corrupted this guard and convinced him to help her escape justice. She is clearly more dangerous and cunning than we realized. The sentence should be increased, not reduced. But her desperate words had the opposite effect of what she intended. The crowd could see through her obvious panic, and many people were beginning to understand that Emma might actually be innocent of the charges against her. Emma felt a surge of courage inspired by Captain William's example. If he could risk everything for justice, then she could find the strength to speak the truth regardless of the consequences. The girl stood as tall as her small frame allowed and addressed the courtroom in a clear, strong voice. "I never stole Lady Margaret's necklace," she declared. "I don't know what happened to it, but I swear on my mother's life that I never took anything that didn't belong to me. I have worked honestly for 3 years, and I have never given anyone reason to doubt my character until—" Now, her words rang with such sincerity that even some of Lady Margaret's supporters began to question whether they had been too quick to judge the young servant. The girl's obvious honesty contrasted sharply with the increasingly desperate behavior of her accusers. Captain William felt his resolve strengthen as he heard Emma's brave declaration of innocence. The combination of his own observations and her obvious sincerity convinced him that he was fighting for the right cause, regardless of what it might cost him personally. Judge Harrison could see that public opinion in the courtroom was shifting away from the conviction he had planned to deliver. The man realized that his reputation and possibly his career were now at stake. He needed to find a way to end this confrontation while saving face. Mrs. Blackwood suddenly stood up from her seat, tears streaming down her face. The woman could no longer bear the weight of her guilty conscience, especially as she watched an innocent girl facing 15 years in prison for a crime she had not committed. "I can't do this anymore," she cried out, her voice breaking with emotion. "I can't watch her go to prison for something she didn't do. Lady Margaret, tell them the truth. Tell them what really happened to the necklace." The courtroom erupted in shocked gasps and excited whispers. Everyone turned to stare at Mrs. Blackwood as she stood trembling in the middle of the chaos she had just created. Lady Margaret's face went white with terror as she realized her carefully constructed lie was about to collapse completely. Captain William felt a surge of vindication as he watched the truth begin to emerge. His decision to risk everything for justice was being proven correct. But he knew that the most dangerous moments were still ahead, as desperate people fought to save themselves from exposure. The moment of truth had arrived, and everyone in the courtroom held their breath to see what would happen next. Mrs. Blackwood's confession shattered the silence in the courtroom like thunder breaking through a clear sky. Lady Margaret stood frozen in horror as she watched her carefully constructed plan crumble before her eyes. The head servant's guilty conscience had finally overcome her fear of punishment. "The necklace was never stolen," Mrs. Blackwood sobbed, her voice carrying clearly through the stunned courtroom. "Lady Margaret lost at gambling 3 months ago. She owed money to dangerous people and needed someone to blame for the missing jewelry." The revelation hit the courtroom like a physical blow. Emma felt her knees go weak with relief and vindication, while gasps and shouts of outrage erupted from spectators who realized they had almost witnessed a terrible injustice. Lady Margaret's face twisted with fury and panic as she saw her reputation and social position dissolving before her eyes. In desperation, she lunged toward Mrs. Blackwood, trying to silence her before any more damaging truth could emerge. "Shut your mouth, you lying fool," Lady Margaret shrieked, raising her hand to strike her servant. "How dare you spread such vicious lies about me?" But Captain William was ready for exactly this kind of desperate action. The moment Lady Margaret moved toward Mrs. Blackwood, the captain stepped forward with lightning speed. His military training and protective instincts took over as he positioned himself between the panicked noblewoman and her intended victim. When Lady Margaret's hand came down toward Mrs. Blackwood, Captain William caught her wrist in an iron grip. The woman's momentum carried her forward, and in her rage and panic she spun toward Judge Harrison, pointing accusingly at the man who had been her partner in corruption. "He knew," she screamed, her composure completely gone. "Judge Harrison knew the truth from the beginning. I paid him to make sure that girl was convicted regardless of the evidence." The courtroom exploded in chaos at this admission of judicial corruption. People jumped to their feet, shouting in outrage at the revelation that their trusted judge had been taking bribes to pervert justice. The very foundation of their legal system seemed to be crumbling before their eyes. Judge Harrison's face went from red with anger to white with terror as he realized his corrupt dealings had been exposed. In front of hundreds of witnesses, the man who had built his career on harsh sentences and rigid authority now found himself facing the complete destruction of everything he had worked for. In his panic and rage, Judge Harrison rose from his seat and pointed an accusing finger at Emma, as if she were somehow responsible for his predicament. "This is all your fault, you little witch. You've corrupted everyone with your lies and manipulation." The judge's accusation was so obviously unfair and desperate that it only served to make him appear more guilty. But his words carried a tone of such vicious hatred that Captain William felt his protective instincts surge even stronger. As Judge Harrison continued his tirade against Emma, raising his hand in a threatening gesture toward the young girl who had been the victim of his corruption, Captain William's control finally snapped. The captain had witnessed enough injustice and cruelty for one day. With the speed and precision of a trained warrior, Captain William stepped forward and delivered a sharp, resounding slap across Judge Harrison's face. The sound echoed through the courtroom like a gunshot, instantly silencing the chaos and leaving everyone frozen in shock. "You will not threaten an innocent girl who has already suffered enough from your corruption," Captain William declared, his voice carrying the full authority of royal justice. "Your disgrace is complete, and you have no one to blame but yourself." Judge Harrison staggered backward from the blow, his hand pressed to his reddening cheek. The man who had wielded absolute power over people's lives just moments before now stood humiliated and exposed. Before the very people he had terrorized with harsh sentences, Emma stared in amazement at the captain who had not only saved her from prison but had also delivered justice to the corrupt judge who would have destroyed her life. The brave guard had literally struck a blow for justice that would be remembered for years to come. The courtroom remained in stunned silence for several long moments as people processed what they had witnessed. Then, slowly, applause began to build as common citizens realized that justice had finally been served against those who had abused their power. Mrs. Blackwood, no longer afraid now that the truth was revealed, stepped forward to complete her confession. She explained how Lady Margaret had pressured and bribed servants to provide false testimony, how the expensive jewelry had been payment for lies, and how the entire case had been constructed to hide Lady Margaret's gambling debts. Within hours, both Lady Margaret and Judge Harrison were arrested on charges of conspiracy, fraud, and corruption. Emma was officially declared innocent and released immediately, her mother weeping with joy as she embraced her daughter in the courthouse steps. Captain William faced an inquiry into his actions, but his superiors praised him for upholding the highest traditions of royal justice. The ancient signal that Emma had given him was validated by court historians, and his intervention was declared not only legal but heroic. Emma never forgot the brave captain who had risked everything to save her from injustice. Years later, when she had rebuilt her life and found happiness, she would tell the story of the secret signal and the guard whose courage had proven that justice could triumph over corruption when good people were willing to stand up for what was right.